And welcome back to the ATN Technology Summit. I should remind you that we're on Twitter, hashtag ATN Solutions Summit, all caps ATN, all caps Solutions Summit hashtag, and that will get you into the loop for discussions that you can have through Twitter, even while we're underway. Richard Marles is the Deputy Leader of the Anthony Albanese-led federal Labor opposition. As we enter election season, it's even more important than ever to hear what plans the opposition have for this vital sector of the Australian economy. His formal portfolio responsibilities are formidable. As well as being Deputy Leader of the Opposition, he's Shadow Minister for National Reconstruction, Employment, Skills, Small Business and Science. Richard Marles, thank you very much for joining us, and tell us what the opposition have in store for this vital area of the economy, and I hope there's time for a few questions as well.
Well, thank you, John, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners of land across the country where people are currently participating in this forum, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I feel like in speaking to this audience, there is a degree to which I'm preaching to the choir, but what I really want to say is that the topic of this conversation about how we better build the relationship between universities and research and the way in which that integrates with our economy and develops companies that can employ people. This isn't just an interesting topic. This is really, in my mind, the discussion which is most important, which goes to the heart of the kind of country that we will be in the middle of the century. And in many respects, I don't think there is a more important conversation that can be had at any point or anywhere within our economy. COVID-19, I think for all of us, has been an experience where we've kind of felt the weight of history. This is going to be a reference point. We all have felt that decades from now, people will look back at this moment and see it as a phenomenon and a time that was defining. And there have been lots of lessons that have come from it about who we are as a country, both good and bad. I think we've learned about the wonder of the Australian community, about helping out neighbours. I think we have learned that we have functioning government around at every level, which has allowed us to get on top of the crisis. And we've got a kind of a broader sense of who's a hero in our community when we think about retail workers or transport workers or nurses or aged care workers. Yet at the same time, what COVID-19 has exposed is that as a country, we don't make things in anything like the way that we did 8 years ago. We have lost national sovereign industrial capability. And indeed, the economy as it was going into COVID-19 really wasn't that flash. We had anemic growth, we had productivity that was going through the floor, we had record low wage growth, and we had 2 million Australians, either unemployed or underemployed, 2 million Australians looking for work. But perhaps in a more profound sense, we get a lesson from Harvard University's Index of Economic Complexity, which really, people might be familiar with it, but at one end of the spectrum would be the most simple agrarian subsistence-based economy. At the other would be the most high-tech, complex manufacturing, sophisticated services economy. The first in that index is Japan. Korea is 3, Singapore is 5, China's in the top 20, Malaysia's in the top 30. It is in some ways an index of modernity. But what comes from this as well is that going into the future, countries which are the most high-tech, which are the biggest users of human capital, human innovation, human intellect, they are also the countries which are going to be the wealthiest. So that in many respects, what this index is the most important long-term index of prosperity. And what we can take from this is that where lies modernity, lies prosperity. The most modern countries in the world will be the most prosperous. And so what's concerning is when you think about where Australia is on that index, and we've really been in freefall. Right now, we rank 87th. We're sandwiched between Uganda and Burkina Faso. Our economy is much simpler, less complex than it was 8 years ago. And really taking a step back, that describes a kind of a radically poorer future for our kids and our grandkids in the middle of this century relative to the prosperity that we have enjoyed now. And so what comes from this is an urgent call for action in terms of the need for Australia to climb the technological ladder. Now, there are a number of means by which we do this. There are a number of indices out there or stats which we obviously have to turn around. Right now, research and development in Australia continues to trend down. It's now below 1.8% of our GDP. Countries like South Korea or Israel continue to increase their R&D spending. Both are now around 5% of their GDP. The Global Innovation Index ranks Australia 13th for innovation inputs. That's punching at about our weight. But we're 31st for innovation outputs. We discover in the way we should, but turning that into dollars is something we struggle to do. And indeed, when you look at the collaboration between the private sector and universities and public research, which is really the subject of this conversation, we rank just about at the bottom of the OECD. Turning science into jobs has been something that we have not been good at, and we simply need to turn that around. But what is clear is that when you do commercialise science, it does create jobs and it does create prosperity. And indeed, when I look at the universities participating in the Australian Technology Network, your work and what you do is speaks to this. It is the perfect expression of it. So when you look at PainCheck, which has been developed at Curtin University, an innovative facial recognition platform using artificial intelligence, it's now in 722 aged care facilities. When you look at UTS's Deep Green Biotech Hub, which is about trying to engage in the innovation of algae-based products. In 2019-20, we see 93 businesses supported by this hub. 19 new startups occur as a result of the hub. And you look at Deacon's HiQ, which is an innovation or an enterprise which looks at high-tech textiles, that's now being used in 200 global textile brands. All of this demonstrates how important commercialising jobs can be. But we need to be much better at turning those that fundamental science into jobs. Now, the National Reconstruction Fund, which Labor announced at our national conference a few weeks ago, is the first step in an agenda to try and do better at this. It's looking at providing the capital, the funds, which will enable Australia to move down a path of better commercialising our science. It aims at playing to our nation's strengths. But it is just the start in an agenda of seeing how we can better commercialise science in this country. But the point I really want to make today is that topic, the topic that you're discussing now, trying to understand how we can do this better, is in my mind the single most important piece of microeconomic reform which faces the nation today. Underpinning this, though, I think is perhaps an even deeper issue, and that is the place of science and technology within our community. Right now, in Murchison, Western Australia, an array of 130,000 low-frequency antennas is being laid out as part of Australia's contribution to the Square Kilometre Array Telescope, which will be based in Murchison, WA, as I said, and in Karoo in South Africa. This is perhaps the largest science project which is happening in the world today. It will generate two of the largest computers on Earth, 25% bigger than any computer which exists in the world today. One of those will be based at the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre in Perth. Think about that. In the computer age, one of the two biggest computers in the world will be based right here in Australia. What the SKA will do is illuminate the heavens in a way that no other radio telescope has done. It will give us the best answers we have had to the origins of the universe. It will take a leap forward in terms of searching for other parts of the universe where there are planets in Goldilocks zones which have biomarkers in their atmospheres. Identifying that, which many scientists believe will happen in this decade, will be a profound moment in the human story. All of this is happening in Australia. And yet who knows about it? Like, when was that reported in the Australian? When do we see that on our TV? The fact of the matter is that we've got the biggest science project in the world today happening in our backyard, and literally no one knows about it. And so is it any wonder that when you look at the proportion of kids studying maths in year 12, that has declined over the last decade rather than increased? We've only got about half the students who are currently in their final year of schooling studying a science subject. We are sliding down the OECD ladder when it comes to the take-up of science in our schools. Well, that shouldn't be a surprise, given that we've got the biggest science project in the world today in our backyard, and we don't celebrate it. And so for me, if our aim is to try and climb the technological ladder, is to be at the cutting edge of modernity, is to try and have that as the basis of our economy going into the middle of this century, it's unlikely to happen whilst we are still struggling to turn science into jobs on the one hand, whilst we've got less kids pursuing science on the other, and whilst we still don't value the place of science within our community in such a profound way that we don't even notice when we're doing the biggest science project in the world today. And so where that leads me to thinking is that we need a very different conversation about science and technology in Australia, such that we change the cultural relationship that we have to science. But I started by saying that we're preaching to the choir, and I want to finish by saying that in changing that cultural relationship, you all are really leading the way. As I said, this is really the most important discussion, I think, which is happening within our economy today. And it really is time that government starts to celebrate your discovery, your commercialisation, and your success, so that your example becomes a beacon for national reform, which will see Australia climb that technological ladder and future Australians enjoy the same prosperity in the middle of this century that we do now. Thank you, John.
All right, I've only got a few moments for some questions, and our next session is already somewhat delayed because of your late arrival, and we'll get to it as quickly as we can. But in the few minutes that I have to ask you a few questions, Alan Tudge, the Minister yesterday, your counterpoint, said that he was looking forward to having some greater input into setting policy in this area of innovation and commercialisation of university research. How interventionist would you be if you were the Minister?
Well, I think there needs to be support is the first thing. In part, this is a question of dollars, but it's more than that. As I said, I think there's a conversation to be had. But I think we do need to be looking at government playing a role in leading and supporting innovative structures, a lot of which are happening in the universities that form part of the Australian Technology Network. I went to Cicada Innovations, which is actually not part of the ATN, but involves a number of the Sydney universities, but people will be familiar with it. It utilises proximity, I suppose, in locating a whole lot of startups in a space which is supported by universities. And it's had tremendous results. And, I know Deakin University well, which is part of the network, and the technology precinct at Deakin University is a really good example of this as well. And in fact, Carbon Nexus there, which was a government intervention, is part of what has spawned a whole lot of carbon fibre-based companies like Carbon Revolution and HiQ. So there is a role for government to be involved. And I think government needs to show leadership here. And I think there is absolutely a role for government intervention.
All right. And there's also fragmentation. We learned yesterday, indeed, the role of the states is often overlooked. Universities are accountable to state governments, even though they're funded through complex constitutional quirks by the feds. So what's the role for better policy, long-term policy setting? We heard from a lot of people in the panels yesterday, and I'm sure this will be a recurring theme, that the short-termism that we've got is just making it impossible to plan. Is there any chance of bipartisanship? You say, Alan Tudge, you both say the same thing, that this is absolutely crucial to Australia's long-term prosperity. Well, is there the prospect that you can sit down and come up with something you both agree to?
Look, I think there is, John, and it's a really good point. And I suppose the way I kind of view politics and public policy is that anything which requires action measured over decades, and this is an example of that, doesn't have a chance unless there is bipartisanship around it, because governments change both at a state and a federal level. I suppose the second point to make is there's not an inherent reason why this should be a matter of political divide. I mean, if you think about why someone's in the Labor Party or why someone's in the Liberal Party, it's not about any of this. So there is room here to reach bipartisanship, and nor, in fact, do I really think that elections are determined by the kind of policies that are in place here. So there's kind of the room and the freedom to get bipartisanship. But what we need, and it's really what I was focusing on in my remarks, is really a different national conversation, one which places science and technology and the commercialisation of it far more centrally in our efforts to change our economy and to put it on a different path. And I think that conversation, which can be led by the people who are part of this conference, is actually the beginning of establishing a page on which both Labor and Liberal attach themselves.
Thank you very much for making yourself available. It's been terrific to be able to hear directly from you and live. Yesterday, we had a pre-recorded presentation from Alan Tudge. He was off launching milkshake consent policies later in the day.
I saw that too.
Yes, well,
nice to be here, John.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time, and it's been terrific to be able to pick your brains. Richard Marles, their Deputy Leader of the Opposition in Anthony Albanese's Labor Federal Opposition. He's also the Shadow Minister, as I mentioned before, for a swag of things: national reconstruction, employment skills, small business and science. Now, our next panel discussion, which is about building strong and scale startups in the ecosystem, will kickstart. We'll get to that in less than a minute from now, as our panel discussions continue through the course of the rest of day 2 at the ATN's Summit. Now, you might want to join in on Twitter all through the course of the rest of today's action. See you again in a moment. And welcome back. Jonathan with you again for our first panel discussion on day 2 of the ATN Technology Summit. And remember, you can join in on Twitter at any time. Now, the session we're on now is called Building a Strong and Scalable Startup Ecosystem. And our lead panelist is Rowan McDougall from Curtin University. We're joined also by Alex Thompson from UTS in Sydney, Jasmine Vredenberg from the University of South Australia, and also Ross Mahon from Deakin University, a late change to the program. And thank you very much, Ross, for being able to fill in for us late in the day. Let's start, Rowan, if we can, with you. Can you take us through what you think are the crucial ingredients that need to be in the mix in order to get a successful, strong and scalable startup? What is it that makes for that ecosystem, please?
Hi, John from one of the BATTA states. It's good to be on the panel this morning and talking with you all about the topic. Look, I think that we really, for a critical mass around building new businesses, the sort of things that you really need are an entrepreneurial culture. You need access to skilled people that you can use to scale your businesses. You need smart capital. And you also need access to engaged customers, so people who are willing to engage with new products and services and take those risks on at an early stage that are required for implementing a new product or service. It's not an easy thing to do. People don't like change, so you've got to have people who are willing to take that early stage risk.
Where do you find them?
Well, it's a good question. So in WA, we have access to some customer base around the mining and resource industry. That's probably the advantage that we have as one of the mining states. We don't have access to a lot of engaged and large customers in other areas. So, for example, we don't have a well-established pharmaceutical business in Western Australia. That's early stage, nascent, growing. And so people have to look at alternatives for how they take forward those ideas, and that's where startups come in. So you can start businesses yourself to try and get early stage risk capital to build those things to a point where you can start to engage with some of the larger businesses outside of the state.
Obviously, it's not as simple as just being able to pick and guarantee success. Otherwise, we'd all be billionaires, and sadly, we're not. So you're sometimes surprised by the failure of something you thought was going to work just as much as you're surprised by the success of something you thought was such a long shot. So what's the best way of trying to weigh up risk?
Well, I think what you're alluding to there is picking winners, and I suppose we don't so much pick winners as we let winners pick themselves. So we really are around into trying to provide support mechanisms for people to engage with. So we look at it from a pipeline point of view that people need different stages of support in their journey. So some people are at very early stage and they just need some capability developments and training around what is a new business prospect and what does it take to implement a new product or service. So there's training required. Some people just need encouragement, so motivation, inspiration from the very early stage to people to even think about this as a career pathway is one early stage component. Some people need capital, so they need a little bit of seed funding to take it to the next stage. So it depends on where you are in the stage of development as to what you need, and we try and provide that pathway for people and try and connect them also into a network of skilled and experienced entrepreneurs, investors, people who've been down the pathway before, and do that as early and as often as possible so that they can learn from those who've already been down the path and understand what the trips, the traps, the hurdles might be that they're going to confront and perhaps avoid those.
All right, and we'll come to the role of mentors and all the rest of it as well, but let's bring in first Alex Thompson before we make our way through the other panel members, all of whom have got contributions, of course, to make on this most vital of areas. Alex, what do you think are the essential ingredients and how do you nurture them?
I think there's essential ingredients and then there's essential ingredients that universities can support and provide. I certainly think that having a really disruptive idea, particularly in this kind of day and age, is really important. I think typically the startups that we deal with here at UTS, at least the external startups that come into the university, what they're kind of trying to seek is researcher support or more niche support that the university can provide. And that can be anything from having a research mentor or a more research applied based program or project that we're able to support them with. But certainly I think Ron really hit the nail on the head in terms of, having a little bit of capital, having that support, having mentorship is all kind of critical to helping some of those startups on their journey. In Sydney, there's been a massive upswelling of support for startups, and certainly we're building networks and precincts based around how we can support different startups in different stages and kind of building those, I think they were referred to as incidental meetings, having people bump into each other in these environments so they can start coming up with those ideas, start building those connections. And that's certainly something that I think universities can provide because everyone's here. And, there's people sitting over in business that are able to offer business support. There's people sitting in science that can offer science mentorship, engineering. There's people who are experts in putting together proposals. And I think they're all things that universities can really kind of assist with building those startups, particularly in the earlier stages as well.
Okay, we're going to get down into some of the detail of this as the panel goes on, but just to sort of put the mongrel question out there right at the start, do students and do people who are coming to you with ideas and suggestions, do they do it because they want to make a great contribution to society, or do they do it because they want to get rich?
I think generally the people that at least come our way are the ones wanting to make a contribution to society. Typically the ones that kind of come our way are the ones that are wanting to address a really big science question, a sustainability question, some type of health-based questions. And the ideas that they're coming up with are things that will make an impact on that. I think for a lot of people, the money side comes later. I think anyone who's on a startup journey knows that those early days are not going to be hitting the big dollars. You know, if you make money, then that's an awesome outcome. And certainly, you know, with money comes additional support and those sorts of things. But typically the ones that come our way are the ones that are trying to make a bit of a difference.
And you mentioned the environment, but a lot of this is actually nothing to do with the environment. Some of it's, I mean, you know, you look at Atlassian, for instance, it's the guys who have made fortunes, it seems overnight, although I'm sure it hasn't been. They may be putting some of their fortunes into the environment, but their business has nothing to do with that at all.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of two ways to look at it, right? Like you can be a startup that comes into a space wanting to disrupt something to make it more sustainable or to make something more environmentally friendly, or you can be a startup that goes about doing something else and as a way of kind of refining their practice, or, you know, even as a marketing exercise can start to address things that have an impact on the environment. So I guess there's two different ways and two different models of kind of creating that impact, right? You're either going it from the start, you become disruptive and your whole product and business is formed around that, or you do it the other way and along the way you find something and address that as a kind of, I guess, offshoot of your business.
All right, I'll come back to you. And Jasmine, one of the things we were talking about even yesterday and already today is that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. What works for you in South Australia may not be what works, for instance, with UTS, as we just heard in Sydney, or that Rowan was telling us does or doesn't work in Western Australia. So from your perspective, Jasmine, how do you see things?
Yeah, I guess we all have our industry niche areas, and us in particular, we're being supported by the state government actually to run a space incubator program. So we have a lot of the space industry connections that are part of that program, and the companies that we attract to that program are looking to disrupt in the space sector. So for us, we can focus on that area. We can leverage the headquarters that's based in Adelaide. We can also leverage the other startups that have been, you know, on that next level journey, the scale-ups that are sitting around us. We can also leverage the research of the university. So I think from my perspective and from here in Adelaide, we have some industry strengths, and Rowan said mining, and I'll probably talk to you later because we have a space startup looking for some mining contacts. But I think it's about, you know, supporting what that individual founder or startup needs at a particular point in time. So, you know, there's a range of different supports we can provide, but as you say, there's different supports and
We're just having some trouble hearing your audio. Tell us the last little bit again, please. We lost you.
Oh, sorry. I think I was basically saying that each area has their strengths, and that's usually driven by research and industry. So if we can work together across the nation, we can, you know, lift all tide really where we're.
Which raises a problem of intellectual property, of course, Jasmine, because people jealously guard their patch. They're terrified and sometimes paranoid that someone's going to steal their idea and they want to jealously guard it. So how do you both jealously guard your IP while at the same time working collaboratively?
I think we've come a long way in terms of how we protect ourselves when it comes to IP. What we do in our program is really train people to, you know, pitch what they're doing without revealing the nitty-gritty part of what they do of their IP. So there are ways to partner with other people without revealing all the details. And I think in terms of being protective, I think that sort of movement has come a long way. As I said, we're much more, I see a lot of people wanting to partner. And in terms of protecting IP, we've got some great arrangements within the university. We have a company in the biotech sector in our program who was a research staff member of the university, and the technology transfers you know, office assigned that IP to that founder, and now we're supporting them through our program. So I think there is really goodwill when it comes to working together when it comes to IP too.
Okay, and I'll come back to each of you, but let's bring in Ross Mann from Deakin, who's also got lots of hands-on experience. How have you dealt with these challenges, Ross, and how do you go picking winners?
I would agree with the prior comment. It's very difficult to pick a winner through this. It's a matter of how you provide the support and infrastructure around people to take them on that journey. The path from concept to commercialization is a challenging path, but it is also very individual. And we see our role in that as to be able to sit there to listen and then provide the access to the right people, whether that be research, whether it be some of the other academic staff, whether it be services external to the university, and to do that on a progressive basis. So it's not just a single sort of point of contact, it's an ongoing discussion. And I'll pick up on, I think it was Alex that was saying, it's the informal aspect of that, where you've got people that can get together in the right area, and it's the synergy that comes out of that. And that's where having a hub or a precinct is such a vital part of having that energy around it. We talk about ecosystems. We've got to create that ecosystem. And there's getting that balance right, that within an ecosystem, there is the new startups, but there are also mature industries out there, and how can you attach them with some of those mature players?
Can you tell me what's in an ecosystem? What are the actual components there? I mean, is it legal? Is it administrative? Is it industry partnership? What are the different moving parts?
It is all of those things. So within an ecosystem, if you look at an individual business in its own right, it has to have the technology, it's got to have the access to capital, it's got to have the access to skills, it's got to have the ideas, generated through the research side of it. But sitting around that, to have I'll say a solid, and I'm talking from a manufacturing perspective, there is a lot of technology deployed in manufacturing beyond the actual product itself. Supply chain, there's a lot of discussion about supply chain at the moment. It is all those other capabilities. And now for a startup business to create all those from scratch, it is very, very difficult. So what can you tap into out there that is existing capability and apply it to your own business?
Okay, tell me how you use industry partnerships, because that's a crucial part of the model that you've been using down at Deakin too.
We have various approaches, and so it is not a one size fits all. It is really sitting there and looking at what it is and how we can link it with a particular business partner at that point in time, and come up with a winning solution through that discussion. I'm not being evasive, John. It is really one where we look at each particular company will have its own requirement, and that's sort of where our job comes in, of sitting there and trying to marry that up with the right partner through that. Building the ecosystems, as we build that further and further, will become easier, because some of those other partners are already around and involved, and it will become much more obvious.
The risk with industry partnerships, and I've seen this, but only very briefly from a distance, is that you get some bright student, you put them into an industry placement, and industry snaps them up, and the vision that perhaps the student had, and maybe even the ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, the kind of whole idea that you've got, suddenly gets absorbed off into someone else's business. And I've seen this with some of the automotive students from RMIT and other places who have been grabbed and gobbled up even halfway through their course when they show that they've got that spark, and then they never get to tread the independent path. So how do you strike a balance there? Obviously, the kids want to go off and get a foothold in industry, but at the same time, they might have gone a completely different way.
That is a really difficult question, I think, to answer, because it does come down to how strong is their vision and their path forward. And that's one of the discussions that we do have with startup companies. Their vision of turning this into the next billion-dollar company may not be the best path to commercialization. It could be that the idea has got to go via another path, and it depends on the area that you're going into. Getting qualification within aerospace, within some medical instruments, is really, really difficult and a long and arduous path. So is there a better pathway forward? And maybe that is via one of those other partners.
All right, Alex, do you want to jump in on that point too? Because it touches on some of the things you were saying. In
terms of students and making sure you're.
I mean, you can't put a fence around them, can you?
No, you can't. And I think sometimes the most amazing thing for a student is the fact that they've been snapped up by someone and getting that industry experience. UTS is very industry focused. We try and bring industry partners not only into researchers' lives in terms of developing research and contractual research and projects, but we also try to bring them into the classroom. What would this student be doing if they went and worked with this industry partner, if they're applying those skills? So certainly, you know, while there is that kind of conflict of what would have happened if this person went off and did things independently, there's also an amazing opportunity that can be formed with them being able to, you know, develop their skills in an industry setting. So I think there's kind of pluses and minuses, and you can't put a fence around them to kind of say, don't go do this, go do your own thing. Sometimes it's just kind of that natural progression, and there's also nothing stopping them from coming back as well.
All right, I'll come to Rowan in a moment. Just on this same point, Jasmine, you mentioned aerospace as a particular area of interest now in South Australia because of government investment. So how important, we talked about industry partnerships, how important are government partnerships?
Extremely important. One of our major partners is the Australian Space Agency, and also the state government's area of the Space Centre. So they make a lot of those connections for those startups into industry on our behalf. Basically, government is our key partner. They also drive some of the agenda when it comes to what we focus on in the state in terms of where their investment goes. I think there was you may have seen a recent announcement where the state government's funding a satellite where everyone will be able to use that data that's coming out of that satellite. So it's extremely important for us to have government partners, but they're also partners in the way that they translate what the strategy is from the government's perspective, and they also make those key industry contacts that the university network that we are involved in may not be connected to.
In other words, for it to be successful, you have to be a tripod.
That's right.
You can't have connections with one or the other. You've got to basically have a three-way collaboration for there to be any prospect of genuine and sustainable success.
There's definitely benefits of having government understanding what the startups are looking to achieve in terms of how they connect them in. They're not always funding partners, but they're more sitting back and connecting those founders into industry. So that's really their role that they're playing at the moment. And the other role they're playing is supporting the overall program that we're delivering. And I guess their driver for that is economic development for the whole of the state in this space sector.
All right. And just before we go back to Rowan, the same question will apply when I get to you, Rowan. When we talk about government, of course, we've got to talk about state and federal, and sometimes they don't see the world the same way. I mean, at the moment, you have got a Liberal government in South Australia, and you've also got a Liberal government federally, so that's working in your favour. But in some other states, there's genuine tension between the ambitions of a state government and the intentions of the federal government.
Mm. So was that directed at me or Rowan?
Yes, just for a brief comment. I'm not expecting you to solve the problems of federation.
That's a huge, that's a really hard question to address. Yeah. I can understand that it would be different in that situation. Luckily, we don't have that challenge at the moment.
No, if you were Tony Jones, you'd say, I'll take that as a comment. But
That's right.
I totally deserve what you gave me, which was there was no question in that. It was an observation. But Rowan, let me throw it your way as well. And we'll come back to Ross in a moment on this topic as well, because I think it's at the core of so much confusion. What do you make of it?
Well, Colin Barnett participated in a panel discussion as part of an event we've been running this week called Research Rumble, and I think joked that we're a one-party state at the moment. So I don't know whether we have that tension right now. Look, states, it would be great if the state and the federal government programs aligned more. I think that there's more that could be done there for them to work closely together on making sure there's not necessarily doubling up, but there's complementary programs, perhaps some working at a very early stage and then a handoff to the next phase of support that's required. That's, I think, somewhere that there could be some work done. There's a national consultation process around commercialisation that's happening right now. And I'm sure all of the universities that are represented on the call have put in submissions around this, and particularly around what government can do. So I think sometimes you've got to make a distinguish between what can be done and what part government plays in that process. The conversation that you had earlier with Richard Miles about how interventionist government should be. I mean, certainly my view is that there should be high-level policy setting, large program setting, but then devolve the management and the administration and operation of those funds to the local level, and they get the most benefit and the most capability building if they're done that way. The more administration, the more application process and difficult application process, the more hurdles there are to access those funding, the less likelihood early stage companies are going to be able to to access them. It's just too much of a burden for them to go through those processes. So we really encourage for at least for small amounts of support or for early stage support, low hurdles, low barriers, get the support, accept that there's risk and that there's going to be some failures. If we really want to change the game in this area, we're going to have to shift our risk appetite somewhat to know that there's going to be things that fail. Take that on board and double down on those that are showing promise and success, and make sure that they get more support as they go. That's what I was talking about earlier. By letting winners pick themselves, you encourage, you set the programs and the frameworks. People who are hungry and want to progress find out about them, access them. They really take the opportunity with both hands and grab it.
Okay, let's not spare though, I'm not asking you to bite the hand that feeds you, but let's not spare the universities either, because they are inevitably bureaucratic monsters in themselves.
Oh, look, so, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I mean,
so while we're asking everybody else to declutter, do we have to put, as a university sector involved in this area, do we have to put our house in order first?
Look, I think we've got challenge. Any big organisation's got challenges. So we engage with large corporates, and they have the same problems that we do. There's this balance between making oversight and bureaucracy and risk that we constantly tussle with. And I think we're getting better at it as institutions, but there's still certainly a long way to go. Universities are pretty risk averse when it comes to commercial engagement. They tend to take an approach of trying not to, or trying to make sure that all of the risks are at least addressed. But for example, there are people in Curtin that are quite comfortable that there's risk settings and measures that are being put in place, as long as you can see that there's controls and you can make an argument that the appropriate controls are being put in place, then you are given some level of freedom to engage. But look, big bureaucratic organisations, they're everywhere. They're not just on the government side. I can tell you that for sure.
Let's go through, because it's not just the ATN networks. All universities now are competing with each other for pretty much sometimes the same coterie. You're competing for funds, you're competing for academic excellence, you're competing for students too. So what attracts the students to your setup? What is it that they say to you made them want to come your way?
So in terms of entrepreneurship programs, I think we look at three real customer types of public personas. So we think about it from, we had a master's student do some work on this recently for us. So it's not just students, but we do think about students. So you have student innovators who may have an idea about a new business, but they're probably a little bit unsure about taking the step of forming a new business. They're pretty early stage, they're reasonably inexperienced. They're probably looking for a little bit of content around what is it to start a business? What even is a company? What's a proprietary limited company versus a limited company? What are contractual arrangements? How do you set up confidentiality agreements, patents, all those things? They just don't really have any understanding of that. So it's early training types of things that we provide. If we then think about the power and the reach of the university, we talked a little bit about that earlier, is that Curtin, I think, currently has 60,000 enrolled students, and I'm sure it's similar numbers for represented on the call today. There's probably hundreds of thousands of students, and then alumni on top of that, there's hundreds more thousands. So we have reach into not just students, but the alumni population. And these are people who've been out in the workforce for a little bit of time. They may have identified a problem. They've got a new idea for a business, but they're not quite sure how, again, to set up the business, or they may be a little bit uncertain about actually taking the plunge and leaving quite a secure job where they're getting paid a regular wage to take the plunge on a new idea. So what support can be provided to give them comfort that it's worth taking that risk, and that they may be supported initially in that risk. So that's another set that we think about. We also then think about researchers who are coming up with new ideas for products and services. So they're depth of expertise and knowledge in a particular technical area, but they may not really know much about how the commercial world works. And so we again provide support and training for those different groups. So we try and tailor support for the different types that we come across.
All right, I'll come back to you if I get the chance. Ross, do you want to jump in on that as well? Because we've covered a lot of ground since I last spoke to you, both about bureaucracies, but also about collaboration, balancing that against competition for resources, for staff and for students.
Look, and again, I'm agreeing with Rowan, because I think the approach at Curtin is very similar to what we're doing here, although we're tailored against a different approach, a different industry group. We are continuing to do that same approach on working with, be it students, be it researchers, be it people from outside the university, and how do we provide that infrastructure around them to incubate that idea and accelerate it into physical reality and commercialisation. I did pick up on your point earlier on from government. I'll say on a government side of it, I think it is important that we have that longer term view as to where we are going and sort of the approach to how industries will be supported over that period of time. Because as we see governmental change, that whipsawing in approach can make it very difficult to give that certainty in the environment that we're trying to create. Research is sometimes a long gestation period. Developing a business is a long gestation. Having some degree of certainty at both a federal and a state level would provide a little bit more confidence for companies as they're going through that as to where they're working and where they're heading.
And this is a recurring theme. People say we just want some certainty and some longer term vision rather than all of this chop change every time the electoral cycle rolls around.
Yeah, and I probably bring a individual perspective on this. I lived in China for about 6 years, so I got to live and understand how a different government system works and the longevity of decision making that you had as a business under that sort of environment, and how they went about it was quite interesting.
Yeah, but I'm quite fond of democracy, aren't you? Irritating as it might be from time to time.
Democracy has its benefits, I will definitely say that. But from a business perspective, it definitely gave a longer term view to companies as to where they were going and how they were going, and then how it responded in shorter terms. And you can have that within democracy. So I do not see those as being mutually exclusive.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if you've kept track of what's happened to Alibaba and Jack Ma. He's just been fined $3.5 billion for stepping out of line. So I'm not sure he thinks it's such a stable system or such a fabulous ecosystem for his business just at the moment either.
He can afford it.
Well, I don't think he can. I don't think anyone with that much money thinks $3.5 billion is small change, no matter where they are. But let's not get distracted by discussing the merits of democracy versus autocracy and all the rest of it as well. Alex, take me through what a lot of we're discussing now boils down to culture, setting culture. Now, it's really in the area of medical science, culture's in a petri dish, but when we're talking about innovation, it's even harder. So who sets culture, and does it just boil down to leadership?
I think there's a couple of things. So within New South Wales, we have this fantastic government initiative called the Boosting Business Innovation Network, where state government pulled together all of the universities in the state and allocated some funding as a part of a program where they said, you know, we really want you to boost business innovation in the state. And what that kind of popped up as in the different universities is various things. Sometimes they were incubators, sometimes they're accelerator programs, sometimes they're a mixture of both. A couple of the regional universities had a more themed approach to the sorts of businesses that they were supporting and the types of programs that they ran. Here at UTS, we pulled upon one of the research strengths within the university, which was algae biotech, and created a program and a hub around that, where we were able to pull businesses in, give them tailored support through different programs. We started an accelerator program and offered research mentorship, entrepreneurial mentorship. So I certainly think that the approach from culture, you know, kind of came from two ends. We had a culture approach from the state government, which allowed a bit of a shift in the universities in the state to be able to support businesses. Businesses became aware that they could approach universities for different types of support, whether that be for funding support, program support, or more niche research support. But we also had a culture within the university that was, UTS is pretty cultural around being able to support businesses, having a real industry kind of lilt to the research and the type of student experiences. But we were also able to pull upon a research strength of the university to be able to offer that more niche support. And certainly that's seen a fantastic amount of success. It's now kind of the standalone thing that people come from across the country to seek that type of support from, and is quite well known. But then there's also parts of the university that kind of push out as well. So we have UTS startups here at the university, which I think is currently the largest student startup community in the country. I think there's more than 400 student startups that sit within the space and within the support programs that it runs. So we kind of have
400, did you just say? 400?
400, yeah.
Wow.
And that's just student and alumni startups. That's not kind of external startups as well. So there's kind of this two things where, from the time that students start their undergrad, this entrepreneurial experience is really kind of showcased to them. They can go start their own startups. There's so many different support options. But then we also have this cultural shift where we're pulling in startups from around the Sydney ecosystem from different kind of research strengths. If you're a kelp company, if you're a microalgae company, if you're an aquaculture company, come and we have all these support mechanisms that we can help you with. So I think there's kind of a couple of different things there. Certainly on a state level, there's been a big cultural shift. Universities are really kind of becoming these innovation pillars that are supported by state government in a bunch of different ways to help businesses, whether it be a more research kind of lilted project or, come and sit in an incubator space. But there's also this kind of experience from the student end of things that's really kind of led it is a really big cultural shift that's kind of we've seen happen.
It certainly is. That's undoubtedly true. And there's a story there that's still waiting, in part at least, to be told. Alex, thank you. Let's just go, Jasmine, to you in South Australia there. And I need to just run this past everybody on the panel, but has COVID made it harder to generate that culture that Alex and Ross and Rowan have been telling us is such a vital ingredient?
I think it actually highlighted the fact that we actually need each other for that emotional support. So the face-to-face contact when things are tough as a startup founder, just going on that journey anyway. So having the program and the support of your community and peers around you is really important. So I think in one respect, it highlighted that importance, and we put measures in place to actually continue that while we were all working from home. At the other side, it actually enabled some of the founders in our program in particular, and I can't comment elsewhere, but to just pivot completely. Their whole industry was gone. They needed to change direction, and it just showed the resilience and tenacity of some of the founders that we're working with. The state government also put in a little bit of support around those startup founders in terms of, especially ones that were on particular international visas who couldn't work and their hospitality jobs were gone. They couldn't travel. They didn't have that support around them. So I think COVID actually highlighted the fact that we rely on each other for emotional support, but then it also enhanced some of those abilities for us to communicate on channels such as this. Having a conference online wouldn't have been really talked about as much pre-COVID.
So we heard from the economists panel yesterday that in a way COVID gave the Australian economy the wake up that it was probably due to have and might have been put off for a few more years, but COVID, in a way, that shock to the economy was probably a good thing in the long term. Are you saying that COVID might even be a good thing for your sector as well? It forces you to address dare I say it, some of the complacency or tendencies to laziness that otherwise might have needed to be knocked on the head some other way?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably not laziness, but just bringing things to a head. Like you say, the software is, eating the world, and a lot of people are relying on that for their communications. So if you're working in an industry sector that probably wasn't going to be prosperous in the next 5 years, COVID really brought that to the forefront. So a lot of people started looking at alternate ways to actually progress their startup using software.
Really interesting. All right, well, let's throw this to you, Ross, about culture and about whether COVID is itself a great disruptor of disruptors.
COVID is definitely a disruptor, and it did force, I think, many areas of the community to rethink what they were doing, where they were going, and how they were going to go about doing it, and embrace a lot of the technology that we can now utilise and do quite easily. So you wouldn't wish for it, but I think the different companies and areas of the society that have risen to the occasion have demonstrated that they have got what it takes to really take advantage of that. In regards to culture, I do think, like for all of us, culture is such an important aspect, both within the university environment and what we are doing, but then at the individual element for the startup company. Having the right culture in there is so vital an ingredient for how they become successful, because it is not a straight road, and there are quite a number of setbacks along that path, and how they are resilient and change at that point in time and react to the, I'll say, the disappointment or the surprise because something wasn't going to go as per the initial plan is important. And then you can see the companies that have done that and then really made lemonade from lemons. So that is a really important part of what we do, and that's where some of the mentoring comes in.
Yeah, teaching people to fail, teaching them that failure is as much a part of success as anything else, and that's, you know, getting used to it, because a lot of people can't cope with it. I do want to get back to each of you just for a brief final comment, but Rowan, I haven't heard from you on some of this about COVID in particular, whether you think it's also been the great disruptor and in fact visits some good rather than just all wall-to-wall bad.
I think we saw pros and cons. Certainly companies that enabled or were developing products that enabled working from home saw fantastic growth over that period, and all of the programs that we had were still well attended and populated, and there was probably experienced across all sorts of sectors that there was this initial enthusiasm when people worked from home to engage online and meet online and try and keep momentum going with the various programs. But I certainly believe you can't really replace that cross-fertilization that happens when people meet. And I think people continue to want to meet, and it's great to be able to engage online, and you can actually access people that you possibly couldn't pre-COVID through online meetings. So you're able to access people because they only have to spend, say, 20 minutes of their time on a Zoom call versus travel across to Western Australia, take 2 days out of their calendar to come and present at a conference or a meeting or whatever it might be. So that part was great as well. But the sort of meeting that we would have had, for example, at a face-to-face ATN meeting where Alex and Jasmine and Ross and I would have got together for a beer and had a chat about various things that we're doing in our programs, you just can't replicate that in a Zoom meeting, unfortunately.
No, and I think that's very much something that people are missing. And from just even in the last week talking to friends and colleagues as well as relatives, they're relishing the prospect of getting back into the office, back into the workplace, getting back face to face and just wallowing in it actually, and saying, oh, thank goodness, and let's hope that's all over. Look, I've only got a few minutes, and our next session will start at 1:30. We've got to wind this one up. There's a video presentation coming in between, but just let me throw a little bit of a curveball at each of you, and I'll start with you, Rowan. I've got you on screen now, so let's keep going. If I gave you the magic wand and you had one wish and it would make a difference in your field, what would you wish for?
Early stage pre-seed funding that's accessible and available.
What, a blank check?
No, not a blank check. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of money.
Well, put a frame to it. What size, what scale are we talking about? You want a fund to dip into? What are we talking, hundreds of thousands? Are we talking millions? What are we talking?
We're talking millions, somewhere between, up to 50 million that would be available at a federal level to be accessed across the country. I think would make a significant difference. And
what you'd all bid for a share each year? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, there's different ways you can manage it, but the Kiwis have actually done a pretty good job with their pre-seed accelerator fund. So what they've done is set up a fund that people can apply to as either individuals or as groups to administer local application of seed funding. And so there's programs that's like KiwiNet for example, which is an association of, I think now 10 universities who came together with industry groups. So there's a committee formed, they've got access to money, people come in with ideas that they have part funding for, they can get matching funding. And it's a good model because you encourage, firstly, you access seed funding, you encourage collaboration of the people around the table, and you build capability of the people in the table who get to understand what a good deal looks like and what's required to get funding. So it's a good program.
All right. Jasmine Frudenberg, what do you think?
I don't want to steal that, but it is definitely a huge area that we struggle in. It's that valley of death. It validates the early stage startups. So having that early stage seed funding, similar to what the US does with the SBIR program, you're engaging with government agencies as well. So it could be linked to government agencies. I think the other elements have evolved over the last few years in terms of university programs have filled a lot of those gaps, but the key issue is money. And government is really the only one that can de-risk that early stage funding. Venture capital investors don't want to get in there that early. Startups can't get angel funding to match. There's lots of requirements to get that early stage funding, and it just tips them over the edge to get that next little bit of support. So sorry to jump on the same one, but that's definitely my wish too.
That's all right. It saved me a wish. I've only used one and I've got two of you down. Ross, what do you think?
I'll go and take that the funding wish has already been used. For us, and it's something that we are working towards, but there needs to be a lot more work, is to having a plug-in business system for these companies. As we talked before, there are so many different aspects that they've got to come up to speed with. Having something that is I'll call it almost a ready-made vehicle that they can get into and then work on developing their startup business and the technology and maturing that would be significant.
All right. And finally, Alex.
So 100% early stage funding is critically important, but I think looking at the type of startups that we work with, one of the things they are screaming out for is infrastructure. We deal mostly with deep tech, and it is so expensive for an early stage startup to go and buy a centrifuge, to go and buy a microscope, to go and buy, there's not even, we have Cicada here in Sydney, which is a fantastic space, but for entrepreneurs that are living in regional Australia, for those living outside the CBD, they want to develop the next clothing dye, they want to develop the next biologic, kind of material. We have some resources here at the university, but we're really limited with how we can kind of utilize some of that. And to have that kind of infrastructure available for startups, and I know there's a couple of models of this in the US as well, would be just groundbreaking.
All right. Well, look, thank you very, very much. You've cost me $50 million plus a bit of equipment for my 4 wishes, but it could have been worse. You could have all asked for $50 million. It would have cost me $200 million. And that would have been, well, a little more difficult, but it's been terrific. Alex, Jasmine, Ross, and Rowan, thank you all very, very much. Now, as always with these discussions, if you want the full bios of any of the participants in these panels, they're all on the ATN website. Rather than using up precious time reading through everybody's extraordinary credentials, I just refer you off to there. And as always, the Twitter handle, #ATN, all caps, ATN Solutions Summit. Then you can have the conversation on Twitter at the same time as we're having these lively discussions. The next one of which starts in less than 10 minutes. 1:30 East Coast time, we'll have our discussion about the role of ATN in particular. And I'll be joined by not just Luke Shee, who is the boss, as you all know, but also Vice-Chancellor of Deakin University, Professor Ian Martin, and Professor Lloyd from the Uni of South Australia. And we'll have our discussion. That'll kick off about 7 or so minutes from now. But there's a video first, a video presentation. There's lots of these that are coming our way through the course of these 3 days. This one is from UTS.
Our new research strategy will see that our research is characterised by 8 separate things. We have a range of things that we really want to be known for as a university, starting of course with excellence. We want to ensure that everything that we do is from a foundation of driving excellence, our people, our systems. And what this allows us to do is be more aspirational and more inspirational about what we can actually achieve from our research. We also recognise, well, hey, we are the University of Technology Sydney. So we want to be leaders in the creation, the use, the leadership of what it is to actually use technology in today's practice, and how do you do that in a really responsible way. These are really the two most critical things for us, excellence and that fundamental context of technology. But we have many others as well. We're creative. We want to ensure that we're connected to our creative and professional practice people. We also know that it's really important that we think about our focus and distinction. We can't be everything for everyone. So we're also exploring, how do we define what we're really good at? What makes us distinct? What makes us different? What makes industry, governments, communities want to come and work for us, because they know that in these particular areas, they'll be able to tap into us in an agile, responsive way and start creating solutions. So we have 8 different characteristics. Explore them at your leisure and you'll see exactly what it is that we're going to achieve as a research university.
And welcome back to this afternoon's session at the ATN Innovation Summit. I'm John Fain, if you're joining us for the first time, and it's my absolute privilege, and I might say somewhat fun also, to have been invited to be the chair and MC of these sessions, these panel discussions during the course of 3 days. And we're kind of halfway through. And this is where the rubber hits the road in this session. We've got joining us, of course, Luke Shee from the ATN head office, if I can call it that, and Professor Ian Martin and also Professor David Lloyd. Now, Ian's the new chair of ATN and Vice Chancellor of Deakin University, and David is Vice Chancellor of the University of South Australia. And rather than spend 45 minutes expressing platitudes and the bleeding obvious and going over ground that's already well trod, the purpose of this panel is actually to take the discussion to the next level. What is it that's going to guarantee the success of what it is that ATN is becoming, and take it through to achieving its goals and its objectives, the vision of ATN to the next level? And you couldn't ask three better qualified people. So let's start off with you, Luke. It's your job. You have the carriage of this monster. We'll hear from David and Ian in just a moment as well. So how do you get things to the next level? What's going to work best, and what are the mistakes to avoid?
Thanks very much, John, and a terrific morning session, or earlier sessions, I should say. And it's great to have David and Ian joining us for this discussion. I think I'll focus on a few things that we can do as the collective, because that's my job as Executive Director here at the ATN. And then, of course, our two esteemed Vice Chancellors can talk about what's happening at the institutional level. So I think one of the most important things, John, and we've talked about this already a lot, is policy clarity and funding clarity and certainty for our institutions. Because as much as there's these lofty ambitions that we've talked about around research commercialisation, ensuring that university research has impact and that can lead to economic activity and jobs, if we don't have a baseline of certainty, we can't undertake the discovery-based research, invest in the infrastructure, invest in the systems that we need in order to do that work collaborating with industry. So our job as a collective group of universities that have a strong tradition of industry engagement is to ensure that we continue to have a conversation with the Commonwealth Government, and of course now increasingly with state governments, to get that certainty of funding, certainty of regulatory environment, to make sure that our universities are set up to do that. I talked earlier today, as we were waiting for Richard Miles, about the uncertainty that's been created around international students and the lack of international students due to our borders being closed. That's the great disruptive issue that we have to deal with as a sector before we can grapple with some of these broader questions around what we can do to help the national interest in terms of research with impact. So I think importantly for us as a collective bunch of universities who have a great strong track record, and listen to those conversations just before in that previous session around some of the excellent work that's already happening, we have to have a really strong dialogue with government. And it's great that the minister and the previous ministers had a really strong interest in this area, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't highlight the fact that we've had a lot of interest from government in terms of reviews and papers and discussions around what universities can better do to align to the national interest. And we have to make sure that that results in proper investment and that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. So that kind of occupies me in my job at ATN. And of course, it certainly occupies the Vice Chancellors that make up the 5 universities. And of course, our friends at the University of Newcastle think similarly. So that's the main thing that drives us in that space. And of course, then facilitating all of those serendipitous things that we like to have across our campuses, where researchers are looking at cross-disciplinary issues, researchers and members of our engagement teams at our universities can work with members of the community and in industry to look at collective interest. And of course, our students, 300,000 students across ATN plus Newcastle, and they are the great entrepreneurs of the next generation of entrepreneurs. So we have to foster a spirit of entrepreneurialism in our teaching and learning and ensure that our teaching and learning is engaged with that tremendously important issue, and give those students the opportunity to do the thinking and the entrepreneurialism of the future. And of course, we heard that there are more than 400 startups at UTS and the Ultimo campus. That's happening right across the ATN. It's an exciting thing. And I encourage all policymakers, particularly those that live in Canberra full time, to come to our universities and check them out.
Okay, working in ATN is very different to working on ATN. Given it's still a fairly young organisation, what does it look like when it achieves maturity? We're talking about startups. ATN in a way is itself a startup. So what does ATN look like when it's at scale itself?
Well, that's a good question, John. I think
that's what I do. That's why I asked.
I know a lot of people keep saying that. I was trying to think of something else other than say that's a good question, but I think ATN is an evolving project. I mean, we were created in 1999, and with a discussion between vice chancellors that had some shared missions and shared objectives, and those are forever evolving. And of course, our universities pride themselves on the fact that we embrace digitisation, we embrace disruption, we embrace the new frontier and the new economy and the new reality of how we live and work. I mean, even last year we embraced digital learning. So,
Sure.
More than 200,000 students online. So
okay,
I don't know if we're ever going to be mature, John, because I think we're eternally transforming ourselves and embracing the new. So,
okay, let me rephrase it in a way. How do you make ATN so compelling an organisation that more and more universities feel that they just want to, they need to be part of what ATN offers? What is it that will make that? I mean, I'm sure you don't want every university in Australia to be a member, and if you do, it becomes redundant, but you want to make it like a really cool club that all the cool kids want to be part of.
Well, I'll coin the phrase that I heard David Lloyd say at our summit last year, which is, as we look at the realities of what's happening in our economy and society, universities need to become more ATN-like in order to find the solutions that we need to fit the bill, so to speak. So, ATN is proud to take a leadership role across the sector on all of these issues that we're canvassing today, and many others, including internationalisation, teaching and learning transformation, digitisation, ensuring that we have people ready for the world of work. And I think it's, we're happy that we're a small bunch of universities advocating strongly and have a good story to tell, and that we can take that leadership across the sector. We join regularly in those discussions with other universities who have commitment to other things, including, I must add, equity and participation, which is an important aspect to what unites us as a university grouping, which is to ensure that all Australians, regardless of their background or circumstance, can get the opportunity of a university education. I think that also extends into ensuring that all entrepreneurial Australians that want to have the opportunity of leveraging the knowledge and capability of our universities can get the opportunity to do so should they want to. So I think it's, we're always welcome to have a conversation to broaden up what we can achieve with our friends in the university sector. And at the moment, it's a great bunch of universities to represent.
All right, Ian, if I can bring you in as the new chair of ATN and also as the token clean-shaven male in this panel discussion that we're having on this session here, what do you see as the vision, the future, the growth trajectory then for ATN to achieve its potential?
So if we're to deliver on our potential as a group of universities and show that we are a collective worth joining, we've got to really be seen as good at brokering the three-way conversation between business, government and universities, so that we all shape the respective places that we can play well together, and that by being good at that conversation, being open about that conversation, we bring others in and want to be in there. Because there is no doubt, whether you look at our education mission or our research and innovation mission, our challenge at the moment is how do we broker that space between those three sort of pillars to work really, really well together. I think we're doing a good job now. I think we're learning how we can best do that together as a collective of ATN universities. And I think the next stage is to continue to be able to be the honest broker of those three-way conversations, so that the environment we set up, the ecosystems we set up around both education and research work really well for the kind of universities that we are, that are absolutely committed to driving progress and making a real and tangible difference to the communities in which we're embedded. So it's that being central to that three-way conversation is, I think, where ATN needs to go and build on. It's already there, continue to build on it.
Okay, now the Minister yesterday said that he thinks there's a role for government to have a greater say in setting policy. And the Shadow Minister this morning said that he believes that universities should be given more latitude and policymakers should stay aloof, if I can paraphrase what they said without verballing either of them. Do you agree with their assessment and their analysis? And do you think there's the slightest hope in Hades' hell of bipartisanship ever being one of those rare commodities that breaks out in your space?
I'll come back to the last question in a minute, because it's a really interesting one. In terms of the role of government, I think if the role of government is, if policy is about setting the environment where business, other community organisations and universities can work effectively together to explore ideas that come either from the university world or the business world in a way that is supported, valued and encouraged, great. If that involvement of government means sitting there saying, well, we're going to go down that research path at a level of depth, but not that one, and start playing the picking winners piece, I think there is immense international evidence that actually says that sort of national governments are really not very good at doing that at the micro level. So I think it depends where you put that policy lens and how far you come down. So I think there is a role to make sure the framework supports those relationships well, but I'm not sure that outside of some very high level decisions, I've seen any evidence that suggests governments pick winners very well. And indeed, I think there is possibly the other evidence that it doesn't work if you try to do that. Certainly when you look at well-evolved innovation ecosystems, there's a few characteristics. One is there's lots of discovery work, but two, that discovery work is taken out into a critical mass environment of an ecosystem that enables it to grow. And many of the things that have worked have been chance. Not chance because it's absolute luck, chance because you are sowing the seed on fertile ground. And the policy is to make that fertile ground, not to shape the seed, is my view. In terms of bipartisanship, I think part of the role of ATN is actually to work quietly behind the scenes, party agnostic, to try and get to that point where at least some of this is common ground and accepted common ground. I think it is incredibly hard to do that, but there are a number of areas where I think for Australia, we absolutely need to be playing a role about how do we achieve common ground. I mean, I came today from a launch of a renewable energy microgrid on campus, and I think the university role in helping shape that energy future and working to achieve a bipartisan future is part of what we do. But is it easy? No. I think at times you do feel like the ice cube on the edge of Hades hell in terms of how vulnerable you are. But I think we've still got, as an organisation, to absolutely play that politically neutral, evidence-driven approach in doing that. But I don't underestimate how challenging it is.
All right, I'll come back to you. David, can I bring you in on all of these issues? How do you see the world from South Australia?
I'm in Canberra at the moment, so I'm closer to policy right now. I think Ian hit it very much on the head. I think the ATN and its evolution is about actually being politically agnostic, but being very much aligned to policy and the evidence base that on which policy is built. I think that we need to critically interrogate policy. To your point, John, when you asked about the difference between what was said about policy setting and kind of policy being aloof, we're policy takers. We'll always be, because we can be policy informers, but we will be policy takers. I think on the way through, we have to challenge it. And I think that's part of the role of the ATN and all institutions of critical thought to challenge what's been put in front of us. In terms of the ATN and its evolution as a startup, I guess I'm the longest member of the three of us who are here from the ATN from that perspective. I see it as I think you could ask Ian, why did Ian join? In terms of why he wanted to be in the club. It is about like-minded institutions, alignment, being able to have frank and open conversations and interrogate issues of commonality, but also having common purpose, as Luke alluded to, around engagement, around the impact that we want to have, and about how we want our students to be prepared for the future of work, but also that we want to influence the actual environment in which they do work. And that's where the policy influence piece comes back into it again. So it's bookended. We produce graduates, but we don't want them to be unemployed.
Okay, staying with you just for the moment though, the federal government recently have introduced a completely new fee structure, and they've basically downgraded the importance of a whole lot of things that were bread and butter for most universities. And at the same time, they've reduced the cost of doing courses that they thought were being priced out of the market. Do you think they got the mix right? And I'll go backwards through to Ian and Luke in a moment as well, but let's stay with you, David.
I think underneath I guess, the intent of the Job Ready Graduate Programme, that there was a distribution of the costs between the exchequer and the private individual. And that's something that the ATN have advocated for over many years, that the distribution of costs is fair and equitable. So we don't have a beef with that. Where I might have a beef, or my colleagues may have a beef, is where there is, as Ian said, the picking of winners and the choosing of losers in the band distributions, and what I would call the short funding of courses which are actually expensive to deliver. So, by playing with the price point to try and drive people from the humanities by making it a far more expensive engagement, I think we do a disservice to society, which says that humanities graduates are not relevant to civil society. We know that they absolutely are. We know that major companies employ philosophers in residence for that very reason. So I think that, if you're going to pick winners, you have to be very, very careful. I think the early data that was presented shows that there's been very little shift in choice, and we all know that student choice is not price determined. It's about subjects and passion, and that's what we want to see as educators. We want students to follow their hearts, to actually follow the things that they're interested in, and we as educators then make them relevant in terms of how we apply them to technology bases or to future employment. So I think the JRG ethos for distribution is fine. I think the JRG delivery, which has moved the goalposts and changed the funding areas, and as I said, short funded some core components, particularly like in engineering, because of the way in which the cap has been kept in place. Every additional engineer we enroll is a loss leader for a university in a nation that actually wants to build engineering capacity. So there are a few fundamental flaws, I think, underneath that.
Okay, so it doesn't get a distinction or a high distinction. I don't think it gets credit. It might get a bare pass or even a fail by the sound of it. Where do you want to place it?
The system hasn't been broken. It hasn't broken the system, but I don't think it's greatly improved the system in any way.
All right, Ian?
So we've moved from, slightly facetiously, we've moved from a system of 8 arbitrary funding clusters that weren't based on a lot of evidence to 4 funding clusters that perhaps have a little bit more evidence, but not much more. And again, they are somewhat arbitrary. Australia is rightly proud of its income contingent loan system, and it was absolutely designed to remove a price incentive from the decision to study at university or not. So it's not unsurprising that, in fact, it's unlikely that this will produce that signal. Like David, I don't think there's a particular problem about thinking about public good and private benefit in how we cost out higher education. And we also have to remember that it's easy to look back to that luxurious period when I went to university when fees were very low. But of course, when I went to university, 12% of school leavers went to university. So we have to recognize that this system has driven much higher rates of participation with a huge amount of benefit. There are, I think, 2 issues that I've really got with Jobs Ready graduates. One is the changes around engineering funding, which I really think are something that we need to make sure that government does look at in the promised review, because I think they are a real idiosyncrasy in the system coming through from now. But also, to come back to David's point, this sense that STEM is good and humanities are bad in terms of creating jobs or building meaningful lives and careers, I think is it's quite simplistic. There's a lot of nuance in there. And I think we just need to be very careful before we go down too much more of that, because there's absolutely no doubt that most of the challenging problems society faces won't be solved by technology alone. It is going to need all those other rich thinkings around ethics and law and social policy change. And for that, we need a well-educated humanities and social science-driven workforce. So I think it's really important. One final comment about Jobs Ready graduates, which I think has been an interesting success, but at the same time has created a problem for us, and that's the short courses. I mean, they're not micro-credentials, they're absolutely short courses. What we have seen is opening up those courses for career progressors, career changers, has seen a huge demand. I mean, all of the ATN universities have, I think, seen a rapid explosion in those courses, but that's not baked systematically into the system yet. And if we're serious about re-equipping our workforce, our communities for the next 20, 30, 40 years of work, the other thing in the review that we need to do is how do we build that in systematically for the future as well? Because that, again, is going to be really important, because at the moment it's year to year. And it's pretty hard for a university sector to build capacity, capability, and long-term planning without certainty around what that does. And the fluxes we're seeing, even for a big university like Deakin, are not small in terms of student numbers.
Oh no, it's incredibly volatile, no doubt about it. I'll come back to you shortly. We've got some heavy lifting still to do on some of the specifics and details. But Luke, just on this question of the government funding changes.
Yeah, John, when this package landed in June last year, I described it as a beast because it has so many moving parts. It is the kind of package that a government puts together when it wants to not put any additional Commonwealth funding into the system and produce more places. So that's ostensibly what the policy architecture was designed to do, and then better align the cost that the government or the funding that the government gives universities better aligned to teaching and learning, which of course then we have the question after that is how do then we cross-subsidise research activities and other activities at our universities when we've traditionally used the Commonwealth Grant Scheme funding, which is what the Job Ready Graduates scheme changes, and of course international student revenues to cross-subsidise those other activities. So we had a few issues around the fact that perhaps the evidence base around those costings could be better and could be improved. That's why Ian's talking about a review, because ATN, among others in the sector, asked for the government to commit to a review. We do have some concerns, particularly at ATN. The cost of delivering STEM courses in particular is not cheap. And we're worried that that may lead to an issue around the viability of delivering STEM courses, particularly high-end engineering, information technology, et cetera, So it is an interesting package. I've seen, as a policy wonk in higher education over the last 2 decades, I've seen price incentives put into the system as quickly as they've come in as they've gone out again, because they sometimes work, they sometimes don't. I've often seen it's a combination of both price signals and national leadership on issues like STEM and other areas that you see as a priority that will encourage enrolments. And of course, jobs availability in certain areas are going to encourage students to take up those areas. So it's a mixed bag. We've got some time to look at it. There is transition funding. I would highlight one aspect of the Job Ready Graduates package, which I think universally we quite like, which is the $900 million National Priorities and Industry Linkages Fund, which is from the savings that the government has created in this package. They've reinvested into this fund, which will eventually incentivise universities and industry to ensure that the teaching and learning that we deliver is better aligned to industry, and industry works with us to ensure that there's more opportunities for internships and work readiness in job readiness, frankly, for that matter, in what we do. So I think that's a good aspect to the package. But as I say, it's a government deliberately decided to change who pays for what in the mix, and there's not really a lot of additional funding in this package. That's why you've seen changes in the contribution rates. And they say it spits out 100,000 additional places. We'll wait and see if that's the case.
All right, let's go through some of the other less tangible aspects of it. It's absolutely vital these days, and we hear this from both government and business, and we hear it from higher education, and everybody says, oh, we have to have better community engagement. What does it look like from an ATN point of view? And if I can start with you, Ian, from ATN's point of view, what does it mean to link into community? And we hear all the time now about social license, and investment decisions now are made not just on the basis of the bottom line return, but triple bottom lines, environmental returns, ethical investment and the like. What's the university or the ATN equivalent? Ian?
I think the first thing to say is it's really multifaceted, John. There's not one metric or parameter that you could say measures good community engagement. Step back a little bit. 2020 was an interesting year. We perhaps didn't have as many friends as a sector in Canberra as we'd have liked. But what was absolutely clear in my engagement, certainly across Deakin, was there was no doubt from local community leaders that they saw our campuses and the kind of universities that ATN represents as being absolutely pivotal for a post-COVID reboot recovery type piece. So we had this sort of slightly schizophrenic relationship that at one level, it was a problematic relationship with our political leaders, but at a very local level, it was absolutely a very positive engagement around how can we open the doors of the campus, how can we have industry industry engaging better with our academics? How can we make sure that our creative industries individuals are working with local arts companies, government-funded arts companies, state-funded arts companies to build that cultural well-being across communities as well? We've seen it in terms of how do we work with employers around reskilling their workforce. There's a whole variety of measures in there, but I think actually you say, how do we know we're doing well? It's because others are saying we are absolutely a pivotal anchor to the well-being of those communities, and we cannot survive without the university thriving. And I think all of our conversations have to be about that. And I'm looking to David, who's been part of the ATN for longer, but my sense is that the ATN universities have really said that is a pivotal part of what they're about. It's a pivotal part of us being a university. But is there one measure? No.
David?
Yeah, there's not one measure. I mean, some of it's got to do with history. If you think about the original components of the ATM were all Dawkins era institutions that largely came from colleges of advanced education and institutes of technology that were put together. So they had very, very practical, applied, boots on the ground activities. They had multi-campuses. If you think about what Ian's got in terms of multi-campus setups, what I've got in terms of South Australia in regional campuses, engagement is kind of baked in to the fabric and DNA of the institutes, the ATN. And then it became one of as we moved through the Gillard area and as we went into participation for demand-driven, our institution stepped into demand-driven delivery of education to allow participation. Participation in education is kind of, as opposed to elite education, is again part of the fabric of the ATN, and that goes back to engagement. So many of my staff, my senior staff, myself, actually no more, 4 out of 6, 2/3 of my senior staff are first and family to attend the universities, and that level of opportunity provision goes to the very heart of ATN institutions. So engagement is not just, how do we link into 2,500 companies and provide better graduates. It is actually about how do we provide pathways for people, opportunity. How do we engage with the Aboriginal community? How do we engage with the regional community, and kind of balance all that while being, if you like, oriented basic researchers who have a line of activity which underpins the economy.
And does that also then attract, the other element that's never been talked about here, we've talked about governments, federal and state, we'll come back to state governments in a moment and all the rest of it, but philanthropic funding. We're seeing the University of Melbourne is opening up a massive new science gallery for the public, drawing on the expertise of the university and acting as an interface between the university and the public, granted by philanthropists, by Peter and Ruth McMullen, who inherited a fortune from the Spotless Empire and have given a large chunk of it away. So is there a role for philanthropy in some of this as well? I'll stay with you, David, and then go backwards as well.
Yeah, I'm smiling because Science Gallery was an initiative that came out of Dublin. I was involved in the setup of the first one in Europe, which had philanthropic funding. But the quantum of philanthropy is almost directly, there's a direct correlation between the age of the institution and the quantum of philanthropy, because your graduates go on to do exceptionally well over time. If you think about an institution like UniSA, which is 30 years old, our philanthropic endeavours are probably about the right scale for an institution which has produced graduates for 30 years, where they've gone on to be successful in society, and the quantum who will actually have the level of personal wealth which allows them to give back. So we can see across each of the institutions alumni who've given back, and engagement with our alumni. We've got 250,000 alumni as a university now. So that is a significant scale of people to engage with and to I guess tell the story of the impact that you have. But philanthropy is a very personal thing. As you try to encourage a donor, it is very much what gets their heartbeat. How do they feel you've enabled their success, and whether they have that orientation towards giving back. We built a facility in the city called Pridham Hall. It's named after Andrew Pridham. He's the chairman of Sydney Swans. He graduated from UniSA, went on to become a merchant banker. But he was a very successful merchant banker. And so when we were 25 years old, he came back to support the institution. But cultivating those relationships, you have to have the alumni first. The alumni have to be in a position where they're able to give back. The conditions need to be oriented the right way. And age is an impediment. The maturity of philanthropy in Australia is quite low, if you think about the US or Europe. So older institutions will always have an edge in that regard. But, some of it comes down to luck as well, and the individual who's been set up to do well. has that sense that they can give back and support community.
Philanthropy, then, federal support. We haven't touched on state support. We need to, because that's a vital ingredient as well. And we're certainly seeing all around Australia, state governments post-COVID playing a completely different role, as we've already talked about in the course of yesterday and today. So, look, going back to state governments as an essential ingredient, back to where we started, how do you get that mix right? You've got federal government we've talked about. We've just touched with David on philanthropy. You might want to join in there as well. But also let's talk about state government and the potential for ATN to improve its linkage and therefore leverage with state governments around the country.
Thanks, John. And state governments have really, as we've seen, particularly during the COVID period of the last 12 or so months, have stepped up in a variety of areas that have been fantastic, particularly around quarantining and dealing with the health crisis. But in universities, we've seen some really great interventions from the states, and probably the first of a scale we haven't seen in a long time. And frankly, you know, most people in universities and most people around Australia understand that universities have been a federally funded project since the 1960s, since the Menzies government made those changes. But I look at Victorian government with their $350 million package to support research, to support infrastructure, and give some relief to universities around taxation, including payroll tax. That's a really great intervention, and it demonstrates that there's an increasing awareness in state governments of the importance of universities, both in the driving new opportunities like we're talking about in this summit, but the role that international students and others play in the general economic development of various states. And of course, many people have talked about this before. International education is a great job creator in Australia. It's a great knowledge job creator. And, you know, the state of Victoria, as you well know, John, has been reliant on international education for a long time. So it's refreshing that states have taken up a more activist role in universities. I think in the past we've seen some really good practice, and as a native-born Victorian, I always bring this up because it's my experience, but things like technology vouchers, which link to universities and businesses, have existed in Victoria for a long time, and it's something that the ATN has advocated to the Commonwealth that we should encourage, both at a state and a federal level. And that's providing a voucher where a small business or a small to medium enterprise can do some research and development work with the university directly, and the government, the state government, pays for it. So those programs have been really valuable. We've seen them in other states as well, and we'd like to see other states roll them out. That'd be a good thing. But when you do roll programs out like that, you do need policy coordination between federal and state. So there needs to be some broader conversation. I think we've also touched on issues like the Aerotropolis in Sydney and, of course, Fisherman's Bend here, or in Melbourne, I should say. I think there's some really good aspects where universities are coming together on big key issues. I think universities have got better at understanding what kit we have. And I remember when I previously worked at Swinburne University, not an ATN university, but certainly a friend of ours, the brain imaging stuff that they have on behalf of Swinburne, Monash and the University of Melbourne is a great example of that collaboration and cooperation that we see. So that's backed obviously by state governments as well. So I think I'd like to have a longer conversation on behalf of the ATN with state governments and with the federal government as well on the role that state governments might play in the long term in terms of fostering both teaching and learning, skills for work, developing industries, and the role that universities might play. Because if we have a kind of much more articulated mission-based discussion around what our universities should do, that can flow on to how we support regional cities. And I know Ian's very passionate about that, particularly given Deacon's presence in Geelong, and how we maintain excellence in teaching and learning offerings for students in regional Australia, and encourage research and research collaboration with industry in regional Australia, not just in our cities. So reflecting on some of those remarks we've made earlier in this summit, John, around the dominance of Sydney and Melbourne, but certainly in states like South Australia, where you see an alignment between state and government, federal government priorities, proper industry policy and engagement of universities, you're seeing really fantastic outcomes that's manifesting through the defence industry and the flow-on effects that has. So it's something that I think is going to be a growth area for us in the coming years.
Well, let's build on that. And Ian, this is very much in your jurisdiction. Does it mean, if you're going to do the sorts of things that you and David and Luke are all talking about, does it mean that you have to de-emphasize the role of the group of eight? You have to stop being obsessed with Melbourne, Monash, Sydney, UNSW, the big unis that have, let's speak frankly, I mean, pretty much dominated policy setting using sometimes just their alumni, their old boy networks. You've got to break their grip on policy in this area.
I think what we need to do is to demonstrate absolutely that the kind of institutions that ATN are add real value to the states and the communities in which they're based and to national capacity and capability. I don't think it's actually about saying, let's break the G08 influence. It's about saying that is not the only voice that speaks to a healthy, well-regarded university system. What we do, how we contribute, is in many ways complementary to a lot of what they do. There are things that they do that the ATN would never want to go near because it's not the kind of institution we are. But it's about making sure that our voice is really strong in there so that there is another set of parameters in there. So yeah, it's making a stronger voice to the counterposition to the G08, but it's not about saying that is the wrong voice. It's about saying actually a healthy system needs 2, perhaps 3 sets of strong voices to say we need to have differentiated missions across the sector to really deliver for the country. I think that's been reflected in the conversations we've had with the states in Victoria as a group of universities in Victoria over the last year. There's some bad things that happened last year in terms of the impact of COVID, but one of the good things was it did focus a set of conversations across Victoria, and you can see this happening more broadly around how are you, Deakin, how are you, RMIT, how are you, Swinburne, how are you, Monash, going to help us rebuild the state? Where are you going to play? Where are your strengths? And how can we as a state invest in that mission in a way that is complementary to the federal funding, but adds real value to local communities? And I think that was actually a really positive conversation. But it did rely on the fact that we're not all the same. And I think getting to a point where we have a set of policies that say, actually, you can't be all the same. It's actually not what we want to do. There's a follow-on conversation which is why are we all trying to be the same and the malign influence of rankings, but that's probably for another day.
Sure. But we are at a point of maturity, and it's almost bringing us back to where we started, which of course is entirely coincidental. There's nothing strategic about this at all. Your graduates, people who have been at the receiving end of the ATN university experience, are now maturing into positions of power and authority in politics, in government, bureaucracies, and in business.
Yes.
So I don't know, you've got your alumni networks, but have you worked out which members of parliament went to your universities and getting some leverage? Because for so long, it's been that kind of familiarity with people in power that's entrenched the role of the Group of 8.
I think all of us absolutely are well aware of where our graduates are going. We're increasingly getting good at following them through, keeping those conversations going. And I think you're right. I mean, Deakin's now 45-year-old, UniSA's 30-something years old. We are now having our sort of first, second, and third classes of graduates coming to the end of their career. But it means that we've now got a large number of graduates at the peak of their influence in their sort of late 40s through to mid 60s.
Yeah, I'll give you a kind of
really build that now. So I
I'll
think
give you a
really
parallel
exciting
anecdote. My professional background is as a lawyer, and there was a point about a decade ago when the Chief Magistrate, the Chief Coroner, the Chief Judge of the County Court, and the Chief Judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria were all Monash graduates, not Melbourne graduates, for the first time ever.
Yes.
And there will come a point where they're Deakin graduates or they're La Trobe graduates in those positions as the heads of jurisdiction too. And suddenly you go, okay, it's not, the world's changed and it's changed forever. It's not the way it used to be. But let's use, we've got 5 minutes left, and I want to use it for something else entirely if I possibly can, which is to come back to this question of culture and leadership. So you are, all of you, in each of your positions, you are leaders. So how do you go about trying, given these tumultuous times we live in, not just because of COVID, but because there's so much cultural change going on, race, gender, diversity, age, everything is going through enormous transition. How do you embrace a new culture? And Ian, I'll stay with you as chair of the network and as the boss of one of the most interesting universities, I think, in Australia.
The first thing is to say, John, it's easy to talk about culture, but it's the hardest thing to do. And it's probably the most important thing in any organization. So for me, there's a couple of things. One is to try and be as authentic and honest as you can all the way through. And I think over the last year, it's not always led to easy conversations, but I think it has led to better conversations. The second is to build a team around you that complements your own skills and is as diverse as you can make it. And I think that's one of the great things I love about the team that we've got at Deakin is it is very diverse, backgrounds, age, gender, etc. But also to have a culture in the organisation where we really go out of our way to try and avoid being too hierarchical, too title driven. You can't possibly say that because, and being as open as you can. And I think, again, for many of the institutions in ATN, that's the kind of institution we are. We are open, we are frank, we want to hear from across the organisation, we want to go there. Do we always get it right, John? No, but I think the collective group of leaders we've got around the ATN table at the moment are absolutely committed to it. And certainly for me, David said, well, why did I join? One of the reasons that Deakin wanted to join was to build a network of peers so that we can start to share what's working, what's not working, how do we build the kind of institutions we want to do in the way that you can't always do in much bigger groups. So it really has been very helpful for me and a number of my leadership team across Deakin in our early engagements.
All right. Now, David, the world is changing so fast. You can't teach people anymore the skills they're going to use and apply for the rest of their life. All you can do is teach people how to learn. So how do you go about trying to address these cultural and social change issues within your jurisdiction, within your domain?
Yeah, I guess, John, there's a couple of pieces on that. One is, I guess, a policy piece, which I'd like to see, right? If I was going to address something, I'd look for single course enrollments with fee help for universities, which would allow people to come in and access education as they require it, because we haven't figured out how we're going to do short courses in a meaningful way as a sector, right? The other piece is to make sure that the programs that we deliver and the courses we deliver are contemporary. And having a contemporary culture, I think, is really at the heart of the ATN, which is industry informed, industry in the classroom, industry in the curriculum, and partnered with us. And by industry, I mean end users. So it's not just, you know, the high tech industry. I'm talking about the people who use our graduates, who actually employ our graduates, whether they're in the not-for-profit sector, whether they're you know in the defence sector. If we don't have contemporary culture in the curriculum, then we're not relevant, I think, as organisations. And going back to Ian's point about differentiation. You differentiate through culture. I think the ATN institutions are in some way new kids on the block by international standards of age of institutions. And so we haven't had the atrophy of tradition, which other older organizations have had. And that I also ascribe to the idea that the flattened structure, that there's no, I don't have a hierarchy in UniSA. Anybody who tries to use positional power to exert their will in my organization is working in the wrong university. It's about collegial engagement, collaborative activity, and actually shared activity around an outcome. I think if you're into that, doff your cap to the vice chancellor mentality, you're absolutely in the wrong institution. So young universities, we all celebrate our rankings in the world's young universities in terms of the way we look at it, and that through that lens for comparison. But if we're going to be relevant, I think we have to be contemporary. If we're going to be contemporary, we have to be industry informed. And I think that there's still a policy gap which doesn't enable that to be as impactful as it could be.
Okay, so those are challenges that you're all embracing. Luke, this is I said at the start, this is where the rubber hits the road. There's a lot of platitudes, there's a lot of meaningless statements that people make, and mission statements and the like, that people don't observe them. So setting culture and then ensuring that culture is embracing all that we're talking about is absolutely critical. That's pretty much all agreed to. So how do you, and the hub of the wheel, how do you go about achieving that outcome?
Well, I'll point to the fact that across the ATN and at the University of Newcastle, there are 300,000 students currently. And we're, as a bunch of universities, have deeply committed to participation in higher education for Australians. We know that half of the jobs created will require an Australian to have a higher education qualification or a vocational education on the flip side of that. So as we increase the number of people engaging with higher education, I think we're increasing entrepreneurialism in our economy, we're increasing critical thinking, we're going to have a more informed electorate that cuts across all of those disciplines. And that's one of the things I think ATN would like to continue to contribute to and advocate for. Because if we close the doors to opportunity for higher education in this country, then we have a problem. And as a bunch of universities that are committed to ensuring that there are enough education opportunities for Australians who both need it and the economy needs it, I think that's how we're going to drive some social change in Australia and continue to have a robust, informed and open society through the education that we deliver. So that's the one attribute that I'm really proud of as a bunch of universities, that we are committed to that participation and equity piece that will help inform and build Australia's future prosperity and future cultural capability and future openness. So I'm really proud of it, and I'll continue to advocate that with state and federal governments.
And I'm sure the story is, well, it's so compelling, as we've already seen in nearly 2 days now of this 3-day conference. There's more to come tomorrow. There's an international session this evening as well, but we've just been touching on so much of the extraordinary work that is being done, the innovation and the enterprise that's being harnessed in these different hubs at the ATN members. Look, thank you very much, Ian, David, Luke. It's been a fascinating session, this one. The Chief Scientist of West Australia is joining us, Peter Klinken, for our next session. There's a half-hour break for people to be able to get a little bit of refreshment. There's a video coming your way from RMIT, this one, telling us what they've been up to as we've been learning from these wonderful videos, so professionally produced, exactly the work being done in the different members of ATN. So I look forward to seeing you again half an hour from now, but a big thank you to David, Ian and Luke, and see you on the other side of the RMIT University as we meet the Chief Scientist of Western Australia next. Thank you.
Cheers.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us for the final session, daytime session for day 2 of this 3-day conference. There is an evening session looking at international and global experiences. That's at 6 o'clock. We'll tell you a little bit more about it towards the end of this session. But it's our absolute privilege to be able to finish day 2 of the ATN Solutions Summit by hearing from the Chief Scientist from the People's Republic of Western Australia, the newest one-party state in the Australian Federation. Peter Klinken has a long and distinguished career, and as I've said for every one of our panelists and speakers, rather than taking up precious time of our conference, we invite you, if you want to know more of his professional background, to go to the ATN website, and all the details are available there. Peter, set the scene for us. What's the West Australian experience on the collaboration between science and industry and what the rest of the nation can learn? Thank you. We've got you on mute. If you can unmute, that's better. Start again. Thank you.
All right, we'll try again. So thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for the invitation to be on this very important conversation. Could I just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I meet on in their language, the language of the Noongar people. So I say, Kaya Nunakot, Nija Wajak Nungambuja, Ninj Kadich Nunga Brinimama Bridiyoga, Kura Kura, Wayayay. So hello, everybody. This is the land of the Noongar people, particularly the Wajak clan, and I acknowledge their elders past and present. My goodness, someone's just told me, ask the host to give you permission to record. Excuse me for that distraction, I'll give you permission.
Thank you.
In the 10 or 15 minutes that I've got, I'd just like to share some of the experiences that I've had living in this part of the world, where we have a very interesting dynamic, as John's introduced. But on a global scale, we're going through Industry 3.0 and 4.0 simultaneously. It's the first time in human history where we've undergone 2 industrial revolutions simultaneously. So the first of these, the third industrial revolution, was the digital revolution and a biotechnology revolution. And we're seeing the benefits from that already. I mean, if you look at vaccines that are rolling out now at a remarkable rate, to be honest. Industry 4.0, or the fourth industrial revolution, is around AI, advanced robotics, automation, sensors, Internet of Things, nanotechnology, and the more widespread use of space. So there is this incredible change that's happening right now. And interestingly, with each industrial revolution, there's been a change in the usage of energy. So in the first industrial revolution, I was still around when we went from wood to coal. You know, sorry, that's a dad joke. For the participants. Okay, that really was a poor attempt at humor. The second industrial revolution moved towards oil and gas, and now in the third and the fourth, we're moving towards renewables. So energy becomes a really important part of this entire mix in the conversation, which we should bear in mind. One of the real challenges associated with each industrial revolution is how education copes with technological change. And there was an interesting study that came out of Harvard called The Race Between Technology and Education. And when technology is changing really rapidly, education struggles to keep up with it. And that's associated with a whole bunch of social pain because people feel alienated, they feel dislocated, they can't see how they participate in it. If you can bring education and you can bring technological change together faster, you reduce that social pain and you move to a more stable and prosperous situation. So it's part of the challenge that I think we're facing right now. And over the past 200 years, you know, education has been industrialized and it has brought, you know, wonderful advantages to humankind overall. But just to put it into context, education from an Australian perspective is really important, not just for the community and our workforce. It is a massive export earner. In the pre-COVID period, it brought in about $20 billion a year, which ranked it third after coal and iron ore as the major exports for this country. So it's something that we should not ignore as well. However, having said that, you know, we're now in the 21st century, things are changing rapidly and we do have to do things differently. So I firmly believe there's a new dialogue that needs to happen between government, industry, the education sector, and the community. So from an education or tertiary educational perspective, it's more than just publishing a paper, getting your international rankings, therefore you get a grant, therefore you get a student, a postdoc, therefore you get a paper, therefore you get a grant, etc., in that virtuous cycle. So that's really good for international rankings, really good for attracting students. But what Australia desperately needs, in my view right now, is mechanisms to diversify its economy. We need innovation and new industries to create these jobs. And if you look at the complexity of exports, Australia ranks last in the OECD when it comes to complexity of exports. We have a very narrow number of exports that we base our income on. And when looking at the OECD, you know, we're last in that. And I just went onto the global scales and I saw that Australia has rocketed up from 90 to 87 in the world. And we're sitting currently between Uganda and Burkina Faso in terms of complexity of exports. So that makes us incredibly vulnerable to changes at a global scale when we've got such a narrow range of exports, in my view. So technology is bringing together disparate areas in an unprecedented manner, in my view. So where we'd worked in deep dives going down in silos previously, technology is now bringing a lot of these different areas together in an unprecedented manner. So data from one area is able to be linked with data from another area, and then using AI or machine learning or whatever, you can generate a whole lot of information that previously would have taken decades to achieve. So this is a crucial time. This is a crucial time, and I think Australia really needs to grasp the opportunities in front of it. We have wonderful fundamentals. We just need to make sure that we take advantage of our comparative advantages and turn them into competitive advantages. And one of those aspects is around the collaboration between industry and academia. Australia ranks last in the OECD in that area as well. So I just want to give you some examples from a West Australian perspective of where government, industry, academia, and the community have worked together in some really exciting projects. And the first one I'd highlight is the Square Kilometre Array, where probably 20 years ago, CSIRO saw an opportunity to build the largest radio telescope on the planet in the outback of Australia. And the Commonwealth decided to invest in it. They bought that idea, and the West Australian government, to their dying eternal credit, also invested in that when I know there were 3 other states looking at it as well. At the time, there was not a single radio astronomer in Western Australia. So that's a bold move when you think about it. There are now over 200 radio astronomers in WA. So it's a bit of the case where build it and they'll come. So Out of that was established a thing called the International Centre for Radio Astronomy Research, and Curtin University is a key player in that. The data that's been generated already from the precursor telescopes has been, dare I say it, astronomical, all right? There was another bad dad joke, I'm sorry. Oh, I can hear the groans in the background, even they're all muted. I'm getting the vibe. CSIRO a couple of months ago turned on their ASCAP telescope, and they mapped 3 million galaxies in 300 hours, of which 1 million had never been identified before. So this telescope is broadening our scientific knowledge in ways, you know, we couldn't have imagined previously. But when you go to the next level, it's all this square kilometre array is going to generate 350 jobs as it's being built. It's going to have the Pawsey supercomputer upgraded to a shift from 1.5 petaflop to a 50 petaflop supercomputer, which will make it one of the highest high-performing computing centres in the Southern Hemisphere. And interestingly, there's a company here in WA called Down Under Geo Solutions, right? And they've got a supercomputer they call Bruce, right? And Bruce is a 25 petaflop supercomputer used for industrial purposes, but it's now linking in with the square kilometre array to analyse their data at a faster rate. So once again, you've got industry, government and academia working together. One of the other great advantages of this whole program has been the influx of talent into Western Australia. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is Professor Phil Bland from Curtin University. And one of his pet projects was a thing called the Desert Fireball Network, looking at meteors in the sky. That has morphed now into a project with Lockheed Martin, you know, that major organization around space situational awareness. And they've got a program called Fireball Opal. Phil and his team are building small CubeSats in their labs, which are going to be used for startups and SMEs. And Professor Steve Tingay, who heads up the Murchison Wide Field Array, which is one of those precursor telescopes as well, is now in a partnership with Silentium Defence in South Australia around space situational awareness and watching where things are moving around in space. So you've got this interesting confluence of attracting talent, wonderful technology, and finding some industrial applications and defence applications. Second example that I'd like to give is around remote operations. And Western Australia, most people would think of as a resource state, a mining state, but it's based on some really remarkable sophistication in remote operations. Where I'm sitting right now, within 5 kilometres of where I'm sitting right now, there are half a dozen centres which are essentially like mission control at NASA. They are running mines 2,000 kilometres away from the centre of Perth, or running offshore oil rigs from the centre of Perth, or underwater vehicles from the centre of Perth. So that's remote operations capability that doesn't exist in many places around the world. And NASA are actually coming to learn from this capability because they want to go back to the moon. And they're saying, if you can do remote ops for 2,000 kilometres away, you should be able to assist us to get to the moon. So WA is more than just a dig and grow economy, and we do more than just rocks and crops. There's a degree of sophistication that we don't have a narrative around. But out of this has grown a couple of government initiatives. One's called SPARK, which is the Space Automation, AI and Robotics Control Centre, which is developing remote operations capability to be used much more broadly from here in Western Australia. And industry has set up a thing called AROSE, the Australian Remote Operations for Space and Earth. And Curtin University is deeply involved in both of those. So you can see how you've got industry, government support for each of these initiatives, and academia coming together in a new way. Third area that I'd just go into is in clinical trials, and it's something that's dear to my heart because I was involved in setting this up. And I ran an organisation called the West Australian Institute for Medical Research a number of years ago, and we wanted to diversify our income stream away from just grants and away from the mendicant approach of philanthropy. And we decided we'd try and set up a fee-for-service business. So we set up a thing called Linear Clinical Research, which was to do phase 1 clinical trials. We got a grant from the state government to set that up. It's a not-for-profit entity, so the money comes back was coming back into the institute. 95% of that business comes from the US. It's got 250 staff, $100 million has come into WA, And once again, it's a link between academia, industry, and government. So these are some examples from Western Australia. My advice to everyone who's listening, who's out there, is listen and understand the needs of government and industry in the community. Don't just go out there and say, we're a worthy cause, give us your money. We deserve it. Thank you.
Peter, just a few questions. We've only got a few minutes, and that was terrific, and thank you very much. I laughed at the dad jokes, although I agree, I could hear people groaning all around Australia. Where does the leadership come from? Does it come from the academy? Does it come from government? Does it come from industry? Does it come from the state as opposed to the federal? Where do you look to for leadership?
At a time like this, everyone has to put their hand up. And it's really easy to say, it's business as usual, we're going to stick to our knitting, we'll just do what we're going to do. The Dutch have got a really interesting term. They have established groups called transition brokers. And transition brokers sit between industry, academia, the community, and everyone else. And they are there to try and do the links between all these different groups. I feel that my job is to be a transition broker. Then the leaders of industry, the leaders of government, the leaders of academia really need to get on board and say, yep, this is where we're going. But there needs to be a clear vision as well to say, well, this is where we want to go. I suspect that Australia has lacked a clear vision of where we want to go as a country. I think we've been very, very comfortable, borderline complacent.
And then finally, the problem everyone identifies is short-termism. You talked about things that took 20 years to crystallize. How do you get the message across to policymakers, to governments that don't look beyond the next electoral cycle? How do you get them out of short-term thinking and transition them to long-term planning?
Oh man, you have just, no, seriously, you've just hit the nail on the head. Well, I spent an hour this morning with the Minister for State Development. And I said, you've got wonderful opportunities facing the state, but if it's business as usual, we will continue we'll have an inexorable, painful decline. So you've got a choice to make. Do you want to set this state up for the future, which is potentially going to set it up for the next 50 or so years, and we all benefit from it? And those conversations need to be had, but they are uncomfortable because of, as you said, the electoral cycle, the election cycle is so short, especially at a federal level, where over the last 25 years, the average government is like 2 years, 7 months. It's very, very hard to make long-term decisions around that, but we have to. In the absence of that, there's no vision. You've got no idea where the country's going or the state's going.
Well, I understand they're going to cancel future elections in Western Australia in the foreseeable future, so maybe you don't have as pressing a problem as you think you have.
Well, I think we've got a remarkable opportunity in front of Western Australia right now because we can look to a longer-term future. Absolutely.
Yes, you can, because it's fairly clear, even though the Campbell-Newman experience in Queensland showed that the cycle the swing can swing back just as quickly, but you will probably see the West Australian government thinking that it's got more than one term in which to put some seeds in the ground and start watering them. Look, it's been great to be able to pick your brains. Thank you ever so much, and for making everything so understandable and approachable. It's a genuine skill and it's in short supply, and it's been terrific to be able to hear from you, and thank you indeed for making the time.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it.
The West Australia Chief Scientist, Peter Klimkin, and as with all of our speakers, you can find more about their personal background and their bio at the ATN website. Now, there is an international session on the global experience this evening, and Luke Shee is going to be looking after that. And just give us a taste, Luke, if you could, as we finish up, close to 3 o'clock now on Eastern Seaboard time, give us a taste of what's to come at the 6 o'clock tonight Eastern time in the global experience session.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact if we're going to talk the global aspect to international engagement and the importance that it plays in the driving an innovation future for Australia, we have to be conscious of different time zones. So we're checking in with our friends in Germany and the Netherlands for their morning at our evening at 6 o'clock Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne time. Tonight, and I'll be joined by Arno Meerman from the Australian University Industry Innovation Network, and he'll lead a discussion with me and some of our friends from the Technical Universities of Germany, the TU9, who are a partner of the ATN, so we're very proud to have that partnership, and some of our key international experts from the ATN as well, and those who collaborate as well in commercial areas. So it's going to be a great discussion and look at some perspectives on what's happening both here in Australia and of course in Europe, and how we continue to have links with other parts of the world to achieve all of these great outcomes that we're talking about in our summit. We look forward to that, 6 o'clock.
Excellent. Dr. Jörg Saathoff from the Technische Universität Braunschweig. My grandmother would be ashamed at my pronunciation. Tobias Quebe from the Leibniz University in Hannover, which is in fact where my maternal ancestors come from. Professor Jens Schneider from the University of Darmstadt, and Arno Meerman, as mentioned. And Deakin University, represented by Genevieve Reid, and Curtin University, represented by Paul Nichols, all in the very capable hands of Luke Shee, with you at 6 o'clock. Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra time this evening, and I'll be back with you tomorrow at noon. So thank you very much for joining us for day 2 of the ATN Solutions Summit.